Hello, everyone. Today I want to do a quick chat about Homo Deus, a brief history of tomorrow, and this is by Yuval Noah Harari. This was originally published in Israel in Hebrew back in 2015 under the title The History of Tomorrow, and then it was published in English in 2016 in the UK, and then finally published here in the U.S. This year, 2017. And I've heard of this author. I have another book that he has written. It's called *Sapiens*, which is a history of humankind, basically a history of our evolution. And I have that book on a future read TBR, but I found myself not long ago, I had gone out for work to one of my locations where I work, and it turned out through a difficult set of circumstances that I won't go into here that I wound up having about 5 hours free. And so rather than trek back home on the public transportation, I decided to they had a bookstore there, and I went shopping, and I saw this book. It grabbed my attention that it was new by him, and it just seemed like it was going to be such an interesting read that I decided to go ahead and pick it up and spend my 5 hours doing that while I was there waiting for that for my work appointment. But anyway, it was kind of odd because usually, I carry my electronic Kindle around and would have had something to read, but that particular day I had left without it and decided at the last minute to not go back upstairs to get it. And that was the day, of course, that I wound up having 5 free hours. But the good news that came out of that was I wound up having this book to read, and it was so super duper interesting. I really just inhaled this book, and what it's about actually is the history of tomorrow. So it's sort of the first maybe half to 2/3 discusses, it's a history of ideas, but it discusses kind of who we are as a species, Homo sapiens, where we've been, where we are now, and then the last, I would say maybe third of the book is, where we're going as a species in the future. So there's just jam-packed of ideas, in it, and he basically he has this philosophy. He is a historian. This author is a historian at a university in Jerusalem in Israel. And so, he writes from a historical perspective. And so he really does a wonderful job of sort of outlining, how we came to where we are now with our dominant worldview, which is still really being influenced by the Enlightenment, this sort of idea of individual liberty and equality, and sort of the individual being the primary valued. The system values the individual above all else in our current system, he argues. And, but his philosophy of history I thought was really interesting to me, because he makes the point of, the reason to study history. I think a lot of times what we hear is the reason to study history is so we don't repeat the same mistakes. You hear that saying a lot, like, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. But he argues that the real reason to study history is actually to be freed from it, to liberate yourself from it. And he gives a really good explanation about lawns, expansive lawns, how in the U.S. anyway, having a yard with a big lawn is a sign of, sort of middle-class stability, and it's valued, and really whole cities are built around this. And, that has not always been the case, and he sort of gives us a history of how lawns came to be valued by people as something good to devote their time and resources and space to. But, through uncovering that history of lawns, you understand that it's a choice that people are making. It might be a subconscious choice, but it nevertheless is still a choice. And so his view is the same thing goes for these Enlightenment values of liberty and individuality and equality. he's not certainly not arguing against these per se. He's just saying that these have a history. These ideas have a history. That our ideas of individualism have a history. Not all cultures have shared, our particular version of individual value of individualism, and he argues in the future, due to changing technology and such as that this system may be changed, or will inevitably undergo change, as all history is ultimately change. So anyway, there's so much in this book that I can't go into. I could literally spend hours on the book going into it, because he packs so much information. So easy to read, though, so accessible. Like I said, I did read this fairly quickly. It's about 400 pages, but just a few takeaways from it. One thing that I had not really thought about was this dominant idea of the Enlightenment being in the background, that we all sort of we in the Western world anyway, sort of take for granted as being some sort of ultimate truth. But he really points out that this can be boiled down to humanism, that actually started prior to the Enlightenment, really during the Renaissance, which values, the human above all else, and the human as being, the individual human as being the greatest value. And so he defines there was this orthodox humanism, which is this Enlightenment idea of individualism, like I just mentioned. And then, though, as the 19th century came along, and then ultimately in the 20th century, there were a couple of challenges to that. They were still humanism, but there were different aspects of humanism, and one of those was socialist humanism, which was still humanism, but this was, social, influenced by Marx and whatnot. And then ultimately, then the Darwinian sort of social evolutionary, called evolutionary humanism, was another one. And this is sort of the libertarian, and ultimately the Nazis were this sort of evolutionary humanism, which is still humanism in its broadest sense, but it values, the best, sort of a ultimate meritocracy. And so he talks about the 20th century as being wars of religion. He defines religion very broadly, meaning basically just belief systems, not religions, dogmatic religions like we might just think of, like Christianity and Islam and Judaism, but really all belief systems. So he thinks this, he argues that this humanism is actually a belief system, it's actually a religion. And so he said, he has talks about the 20th century being these wars of religion, where the orthodox humanism was challenged first by socialism and then by Nazism, and was almost defeated by socialism, but then came roaring back kind of in the late 80s and early 90s, and it has been really unchallenged since then, although it is being challenged now by the changing technology, as I mentioned. So I'm going to need to kind of speed up. I'm probably going to run out of time on my video, but just he's in this first part of the book, he talks about how most of human history have been spent in wars and plagues, and three things: wars, plagues, and famines. So humans that's consumed most of our energy and our attention and our resources has been combating these three things. And he spends a lot of time in the book showing us that we've basically eradicated those, where now, even though we have this perception of violence still, and there is still too much violence, but that now people are far more apt to, at least here in most of the world, to die from other causes rather than from violence. There are the other causes, like, for example, overeating, than famine, and die from things like plagues are mostly, have been eradicated, where these plagues that used to sweep the world, that would wipe out millions upon millions of people, have been largely controlled. The challenges that have come along, like HIV, have been more or less contained, like Ebola. And then war, also he goes into how war has been drastically reduced over the course of the last 100 years or so. And then, he sort of looks at what maybe humans would focus our attention on moving forward, and he argues that we seem to be focusing on happiness, bliss, whether that's artificial through development of pills or some other sort of intervention in our biology, or and also immortality, which is not just eliminating disease and plague, but actually extending the lifespan. And then he spends a lot of other time talking about artificial intelligence and robotics and this sort of information age that we live in that is rapidly changing the structure of our society. And then the last third of the book is really what that future society may look like. And when I was reading the reviews of some other reviews of people who had done reviews on Amazon, a lot of people seem to be very frightened by that future. I didn't really see it as so much as frightening. I do think it's probably inevitable that we have some pretty dramatic shifts in our society. How all that's going to shake out, I don't really know, but I did really, really love reading about the potential changes. One main sort of overarching idea that he thinks may actually take the place of the dominant humanism that exists now would be more systems approaches, like he calls it Dataism, which is sort of a worldview of systems and data and groupings and different sets of people rather than individual people, sort of starting to drive the structure of society. So, I just found it all really interesting. I did think, he talks about immortality there, work in longevity, and the potential ability to augment, to change humans, like change our intelligence, change our structures, change our eyesight, change our physical abilities, and that these changes appear to be coming. And, immortality, I don't know. I always think, the thing about aging is, one challenge of aging is to, maintain the ability to change and shift and think in new ways, because I think one of humans' default categories is actually, getting in a set way of thinking and then sticking to it. And so I wonder how if we change our lifespan, how that would actually impact the rate of change, And then bliss, the same thing. He does talk about bliss as far as chemically altering us where we could be happy all the time, and whether or not that's a good thing. So I'm almost out of time. I'm not sure I did this book chat justice, just because there's so much in it. It's just a sweeping, grand history of ideas, and then just talking about ideas. And it's just, to me, it was just a fun, interesting, entertaining book that I learned a lot from, and really caused me to pause and think about a lot of things. And it's still causing me to think about them. I do want to probably eventually read it again. It's very easy to read, about 400 pages though, but it didn't take me long. I will eventually also get to Sapiens, his other book, and I'll probably get to that on my reading list next year, looks like, at this point. So I'll leave it at that, and leave it there. I should have another chat coming up with the next thing I've read pretty soon, so stay tuned. Take care. Bye.